Hello, my name is Valerie Bradley, and I'm president of Save Harlem Now. And I would like to welcome you to the Road to Harlem, the churches. We are very pleased to be able to um, come to you this evening with a very special webinar about a very special church. It's the Shiloh Presbyterian Church, which was first named the first colored church and then renamed the Shiloh Presbyterian Church. And that was the first Black Presbyterian church in New York City. It has since been named the St. James Presbyterian Church, which is a special church to us here in Harlem, especially since this was the place where the Harlem School of the Arts was founded. And I'm sure our guest presenter will give you a lot more information about that. He's called the Two Doctors because he has a PhD in preaching and in New Testament, which is almost unheard of. But you're going to see how special he is once he starts his presentation. He has been the pastor of St. James for quite some time. He's a preservationist. That's how we met him at Save Harlem Now. And St. James is a landmark in the Hamilton Heights Historic District. It does not have an individual landmark as a church, but it is a designated landmark because it is in a historic district. And that's what having a historic district can do for a neighborhood and for buildings in a neighborhood. And it has helped preserve a very special church in the history of African Americans, especially in the faith community here in Harlem. And so, with no further elaboration, I'd like to turn this program over to Reverend Dr. Derrick McQueen.
And I thank you so very much, Valerie. I'm so glad to be here with you all this evening. And I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I'll be sharing with you. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can get some of these images and some of these wonderful things that we're going to be speaking about this evening. As she mentioned, I am the Reverend Dr. Derrick McQueen, pastor here at St. James Presbyterian Church. I've been the pastor here for 10 years, but I've been involved with the community for over 20 years. And it is a joy to be with you here tonight. So I want to begin by thanking Save Harlem Now and West Village Preservation for making this conversation possible. This partnership matters because it reminds us that Harlem and Greenwich Village are not separate histories. They are chapters in the same New York story. Tonight, I want us to travel through that story by following institutions as they move through the city, carrying memory, faith, leadership, imagination, and possibility from one neighborhood to another. Building Harlem, Shiloh, St. James, and the institutions that made Black New York, a journey from Lower Manhattan to Harlem through the institutions, people, and places that helped build Black New York. As a New Testament scholar, one of my professors once said, "Thank goodness the gospel writers did not write down what happened, but they wrote down what it meant." And I have come to understand Black New York in a very similar way. Yes, dates matter. Buildings matter. Addresses matter. Yet history becomes transformative when we begin to ask what those places made possible. And so the question I would like us to carry tonight is, what did make these places possible? Because this is not a story about migration alone. It's not a story about displacement alone. It's not a story about survival alone. It is a story about institution building. And it is a story about Black New Yorkers who understood that freedom required structure, required churches, newspapers, schools, homes, meeting places, sanctuaries, and communities. It required places where people could gather and imagine futures together. And I have become convinced that institutions carried memory northward through the city. They carried theology, leadership, relationships, education, and imagination. They made Harlem possible long before Harlem even entered the story. The journey begins with Samuel Eli Cornish. Many people know Cornish as the founder of Freedom's Journal in 1827, the first African-American owned and operated newspaper in the United States of America. Now, that achievement alone would secure his place in history. And he was also a Presbyterian minister and the founder of Shiloh Presbyterian Church in 1822, when slavery was still legal in the state and in the city of New York. Samuel Eli Cornish founded an abolitionist African-American Presbyterian church. I want us to pause here because the temptation to begin is always to begin Black New York in Harlem. But doing so unintentionally erases generations of labor, institution building that had already been unfolding throughout lower Manhattan. Before Harlem, there was Black New York. Imagine New York in the early 19th century. The slide you see in front of you, Shiloh was one of the little pink buildings closest to that green street, which is Rose Street, which no longer exists in lower Manhattan. Entire neighborhoods that we know have not yet been formed, not even been imagined in the forms we recognize. Yet Black New Yorkers are already building congregations, newspapers, and schools and systems of mutual aid. They understood that freedom required places where people could worship, organize, learn, protect one another, and imagine futures beyond the limits imposed on them. Institutions were not simply buildings. In Black history, institutions often functioned as acts of collective imagination, saying, "We intend to stay." When we follow Shiloh through the city, this first third of this map here that you see, we begin to see something important, that Rose Street and 119 Elm Street, Frankfurt and William Street, 61 Prince Street, 456th Avenue, 167 West 26th Street, and then over in 5 Points. These are more than addresses. They are evidence that Black New York was already moving through the city, shaping the city, and carrying witness from one neighborhood to another. We were actually watching memory travel northward. And the movement was not random. The communities, of course, were responding to changing demographics, economic realities, urban development, and opportunities to build something larger than themselves. But what matters is that they never stopped building. Harlem did not emerge from nowhere. Harlem inherited a city that Black New Yorkers had been already shaping for decades. And that is why the Northward movement matters. It allows us to see Harlem not as an isolated destination, but as an inheritor of a much longer Black urban history. There's another detail that helps us appreciate the significance of Shiloh's place in Black New York. Frederick Douglass was married in Shiloh Sanctuary after his arrival to New York City following his escape from enslavement. I love that detail because it reminds us that institutions are not merely places where people worship, they are places where life begins. Imagine Frederick Douglass, newly arrived in freedom, standing within a community that could bless not only his liberation, but his future. That moment tells us something important about Shiloh. It was already serving as a place of longing, protection, and possibility long before Harlem entered the story. Black New Yorkers had created institutions capable of welcoming people into entirely new lives. Shiloh did not simply house worship, it received freedom itself. This place that you see, 119 Elm Street, one of the most poignant moments in this story takes place here. Now, today, many of us New Yorkers and those who come to New York City would reorient themselves by saying that this site is down the street from Katz's Delicatessen, right down the street from this Canal Street and subway station, Canal and Lafayette. But beneath that familiar landscape lies a familiar story. This was once an early home of Shiloh Presbyterian Church. They raised the money in 1822 to build this beautiful structure that you see. And because of the politics of Samuel Eli Cornish, the presbytery called in the loans and many of the monies that were due and sold the building to B'nai Jeshurun after being taken from Shiloh. Sit with that for a moment, because loss enters our story very early. Institutional vulnerability enters our story. Dispossession enters our story. The story could have ended there, yet instead, the community kept moving. This is one of the reasons why preservation work matters so deeply. For preservation is not nostalgia. Preservation is an act of remembering what cities often forget. Sometimes the building is gone. Sometimes the street itself has changed beyond recognition. Sometimes the visible evidence is almost entirely erased. Still, the meaning remains available if we know how to look. Yes, that building was lost early, but the witness continued. So we now arrive at Theodore Sedgwick Wright. And here, historical imagination becomes one of our most important tools. Imagine walking through Tribeca today. Imagine ordinary storefronts, retail spaces, restaurants, and the everyday life of contemporary New York. Then imagine that freedom seekers from the South once moved quietly through those same streets. Imagine that what now appears to be an ordinary building on your right once sheltered extraordinary courage. 235 West Broadway is now the Tom Snyder clothing store, and its name Tom Snyder Liquor Store was also part of the Underground Railroad. It still stands as it stood in the 1800s. In 1809, when the house was built, much of Tribeca was farmland. That was not farmland, would have looked very different from the city that we know. It was originally constructed for a Gideon Tucker, an alderman and education commissioner, as one of a row of mixed residential and commercial buildings serving and expanding New York. But from 1842 to 1847, this house took on a very different purpose. Theodore Sedgwick Wright transformed it into a station of liberation. Wright was the first Black graduate of Princeton Theological Seminary and among the earliest Black college graduates in the entire United States. He not only pastored Shiloh, but he helped found the New York Vigilance Committee, an organization that assisted people fleeing enslavement on their journeys toward Canada. Over 1,000 people found pathways toward freedom through the work of Wright and his colleagues. I love this story because it teaches us how to see differently. Ordinary buildings are often extraordinary archives. Cities remember. Our task is to learn how to read them. Imagine the fear that people carried into this very house you're looking at. Imagine the courage required to open the door. Imagine neighbors and abolitionists who understood that architecture itself could become an instrument of liberation. That, too, is New York. That, too, is part of the story that Harlem inherits. Now we arrive at Henry Highland Garnett, another pastor of Shiloh Presbyterian. Garnett represents something profound in this history. He understood that faith and civic responsibility belonged together. He was a pastor, abolitionist, and public intellectual whose life reminds us that institutions are not passive. They shape life, public life. They form conscience. They create leaders. They give people language for freedom before freedom has arrived. And he was in danger, as he was one going around and was quoted as saying, if you do not believe in the liberation and the abolishment of slavery, then perhaps you need to sell all of your land and move south and give the North to those who deserve liberation and freedom. This is his daughter, Sarah Garnett. I want to give her a brief pause because she was far more than a supporting figure in someone else's story, her father. She was New York City's first Black female public school principal and a tireless advocate for educational access for Black children. Her work reminds us that institution building was taking place simultaneously in sanctuaries and classrooms. If Samuel Eli Cornish built newspapers and Henry Highland Garnett built public theological witness, Sarah Garnett built educational pathways that would carry generations forward. I think her presence is especially important because she helps us resist a patriarchal reading of Black New York. Women were never simply accompanying this work. They were architects of it. They understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that institutions are ultimately investments in children and in futures they themselves may never fully see. Sarah Garnett helps us to remember that Harlem would eventually inherit not only churches and leaders, but educational traditions already being carefully cultivated downtown. Now, one of my favorite stories in this entire journey involves Henry Highland Garnett's daughter. During a period of tremendous instability and danger, the Harlem draft riots of 1863, when many of the Irish, the poor Irish, were so upset because they were being drafted into the Civil War for the Union Army. And the Blacks who were free that were here, they were afraid were taking their jobs. They burned schools, they burned hospitals where Blacks were. And they came to assassinate Henry Highland Garnett. But Sarah Garnett changed the nameplate outside of their home to conceal her father's location from a violent mob. He escaped to Washington, D.C., where he would remain to the end of the Civil War as the first and become the first African American to speak to Congress after the Civil War, where he came back to New York to Shiloh. I find this detail about Sarah Garnett extraordinary because history is not always preserved by famous speeches. Sometimes history is preserved by someone quietly changing a nameplate on the door. And the draft riots remind us that violence was real. The courage was real as well. This small act of protection teaches us something profound about Black New York. Communities survived because they learned how to protect one another. They developed habits of care. They built systems of trust. They understood that collective well-being was everyone's responsibility. That may be one of the greatest lessons these institutions offer all of us today. Communities are built long before crises arrive. They are built in newspapers, those sanctuaries, homes, schools, and everyday acts of fidelity, so that by the time danger does come, the relationships that save lives have already been formed. And Shiloh's story is not ending here. Its memory, as it was forced to close in 1891 by the Presbyterian of New York City for another debt, its memory was about to become St. James. The institutions that carried Black New York through Lower Manhattan, Greenwich Village, Chelsea, and Five Points are now preparing to help build Harlem itself. When Shiloh closes, another story begins. I have become increasingly careful about how I describe this moment because I do not think that St. James replaces Shiloh. St. James resurrects Shiloh. Pierce Butler Tompkins fought for 3 years after he graduated from Union Theological Seminary. For 3 years, he fought with the Presbyterian of New York City to make sure that another Black church was established within the bounds of the New York City Presbytery in Manhattan. There's a difference. Resurrection carries memory forward. The communities, relationships, theological commitments, and habits of institution building that shaped Shiloh find new life in St. James Presbyterian Church under the leadership of Pierce Butler Tompkins. Yes, it too was first named by the Presbytery, the first colored Presbyterian church. And they quickly, after incorporation, changed their name to St. James Presbyterian Church. This distinction matters because of one of the central arguments of our evening is that institutions carried memories northward through New York City, but memory never remained fixed to a single address. It traveled, adapted, and expanded. And now we begin to watch St. James make its own journey. I'm especially glad to pause here because one of our co-sponsors, West Village Preservation, helps us to see something that is often overlooked. Too often we begin Black history in Harlem, unintentionally erasing this extraordinary life that already existed through Lower Manhattan, Soho, Greenwich Village, and Chelsea. To the left you see 450 6th Avenue. Reminds us that Harlem did not emerge in isolation. Harlem inherited, adapted, and expanded a witness that had already been moving through New York for generations. I particularly love the language that Greenwich Village still holds Shiloh's story. West Village Preservation has a wonderful article about St. James that talks all about Shiloh and talks about this particular location that still exists today. Hold is a beautiful word because it suggests care, stewardship, and the possibility that places continue to carry memory long after institutions have moved elsewhere. This also is one of the gifts that preservation offers us. It teaches us that neighborhoods are not isolated stories. New York City is a continuum. We go back to this map and talk about building Harlem through generations. We begin to watch St. James build Harlem. St. James, after Shiloh, moved from downtown. The journey moves from 108 to 108 West 132nd Street. Then it moves to 211 West 32nd Street, then to 69 West 137th Street, and then finally to 409 West 141st Street. We're witnessing more than movement through the city. We're watching now institutional strategy. I would argue that Harlem was one of the great acts of collective imagination in the 20th century. Black America. People often speak of migration as though people simply arrived. What I see in this story, in these lines, is intention, planning, investment, and a series of decisions about where Black New Yorkers would own, build, worship, educate, and flourish. Oddfellows Hall was a building on 32nd Street where St. James used to worship. And when Penn Station declared eminent domain, it moved St. James and Abyssinian and other churches, other Black churches, out of Midtown after they had already been displaced from Lower Manhattan. But I want to get to a point further up now, where William Lloyd Imes and Adam Clayton Powell Sr. enter our story. Now, Imes deserves particular attention because he helps us understand St. James not simply as a congregation that moved to Harlem, but as an institution that helped shape Harlem's future. He too was a pastor, public thinker, civic leader, and institutional strategist, and another pastor of St. James that graduated from Union Theological Seminary. As an alumnus, he would eventually become Union's first Black board member, a detail that matters very deeply in this story, because he did not simply receive formation from an institution, he returned to participate in its governance. That pattern is one we will see later again with Dorothy Maynor and the Metropolitan Opera. Black leaders were not merely asking to be included in institutions that had once excluded or limited them. They were entering those institutions, reshaping them, and building new ones for those who would come after. Adam Clayton Powell Sr. provides a parallel and deeply connected witness through Abyssinian Baptist Church, with whom we still worship on Thanksgiving Day. 110 years later, after Texas Buffalo soldiers were forced into dishonorable discharge by Teddy Roosevelt. Today, many people hear the Powell name and think of Adam Clayton Powell Jr., yet his father was one of the great architects of modern Harlem. Powell and Imes were not simply two prominent pastors serving two prominent congregations. They were institutional partners in deliberate building of a Black urban future. Together, Abyssinian and St. James helped anchor a community that was learning how to own property, establish businesses, educate children, cultivate leadership, and imagine itself as more than a place of arrival. Harlem became a place of construction. That construction of Pennsylvania Station displaced communities and institutions, and that displacement could have remained a story of loss. Instead, African-American leaders like Imes and of St. James and Powell Abyssinian recognized an opportunity within adversity. They understood that Harlem represented an opportunity to create Black community on a scale New York had never seen before. Their work was not simply to relocate their congregations. Their work was to encourage New Yorkers to own, build, live, and thrive in Harlem. And that is what makes this story so remarkable. Adversity became opportunity. Displacement became a strategy. Communities refused to surrender their imagination. I particularly love this moment because it grounds history in contemporary life. Today, New Yorkers buy bagels where St. James once worshiped. At 108 West 32nd Street, we now have Essa Bagel, where Oddfellows housed one of its chapters of this story that we're talking about. The detail may sound delightful at first, and yet it also reminds us that sacred history often lives in ordinary places. Cities do reinvent themselves constantly. Memory remains for those who are willing to look for it. One day this was a sanctuary, today it was a bagel shop. But the sacredness of that history has not disappeared. It simply asks us again, as I said earlier, to pay attention. At this point, I want to appreciate the scale of what St. James became. At one point, St. James numbered over 3,000 members, with some accounts placing the number closer to 4,000. I do not share this as an exercise in nostalgia, and I'm not lamenting what churches no longer are. I share it because it reveals what Harlem itself was becoming. St. James was no longer simply a congregation. It had become a civic institution, a place where those relationships formed, leadership emerged, children nurtured, artists developed, and people learned to imagine themselves as participants in Harlem's future. Infrastructure may be the best word for what we are witnessing. Harlem was built because institutions had the capacity to sustain it. And that distinction is important. The question was never simply how large a church could become. The deeper question was how many lives could be interconnected throughout that institution. A congregation of 3,000 to 4,000 people represents far more than its membership rolls. It represented households, families, teachers, musicians, civic leaders, children, elders, organizers, and neighborhoods connected through shared institution. Such a church could not only shape Sunday worship, but the social, educational, cultural, and economic imagination of a community. And I think St. James answered that question magnificently. One of the stories that I find most moving concerns 69 West 137th Street. Today, it is Rendell Memorial Presbyterian Church, actually a church that came out of St. James. At first glance, you might think that this modest building built by Ludlow and Valentine is simply another address right across the street from the emergency door at Harlem Hospital. But it's much more than that. When St. James prepared to move to 409 West 141st Street in 1927, the congregation refused to surrender the lease to the presbytery until another Black mission was founded. I love this story because it reveals extraordinary congregational efficacy. This Black congregation insisted that its departure create another beginning. It spoke boldly to a predominantly white denomination and said, in essence, our witness must continue. What an extraordinary act of imagination. Because our move was never about relocation. It was about multiplication. And that witness remains alive today through Rendell Presbyterian Church that you see in front of you, founded by a handful of people in St. James who said, I'll go and start a new mission, and named it after their professor at Lincoln University. They inherited the commitments, not just the buildings. They inherited the promises and responsibilities. So as we say, once again, at 69 West 137th Street, the witness multiplied. Now, while I have you looking at this congregation, civic institution, and ecosystem slide with 3,000 to 4,000 members and building at scale, I want you to pause for a moment from imagery and go into your imaginations. I want you to help me picture something. An image I would like us to actually imagine together. Imagine before we move toward our closing reflections. Imagine Harlem in 1927. Imagine hundreds of footsteps. Imagine choir robes, hats, children trying to keep pace with their parents, and hymnals tucked under arms. Imagine neighbors watching from windows and standing on stoops. Imagine people asking, where are they going? 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 people. And imagine the answer coming back. St. James is moving to 141st Street. I want to be careful here because we do not know exactly what happened that day. And historical imagination does require discipline. We do know this. But imagine it. A congregation numbering in the thousands was relocating its spiritual home. And that relocation was a public declaration. I want to linger with that image because it starts to gather so much of this story together. This was not merely a congregation walking a few blocks. It was a Black institution making itself visible in Harlem. It literally was a community carrying memory, its historical records, its music, its leadership, children, elders, and aspiration through the streets of Harlem. It was a procession of people who had inherited Rose Street back in the day, and Elm Street, Frankfurt Street, Prince Street, 6th Avenue, West 26th Street, West 32nd Street, and who are now carrying that long line of witness into a new home at 141st Street. The route was short. The history being carried was immense. Harlem was not built in boardrooms alone. Harlem was built in processions, sanctuaries, schools, stoops, newspapers, and ordinary acts of collective imagination. That observation now prepares us for our final movement because the story does not end with buildings. It expands into possibility. I've intentionally saved this section for near the end of our journey because I want to resist a common temptation. We often tell stories of institutions by pointing to their most famous alumni, and there's nothing wrong with that. Although fame is not the point. The point is what institutions make possible. Dorothy Maynor. Dorothy Maynor understood this deeply. Too often, Black stories are told, Black artists are told through institutions that excluded them, as though that denial is the very center of their narrative. I don't want to tell her story that way. Yes, the United States denied Black women like Maynor full access to its operatic stages, including the Metropolitan Opera. That is only part of the truth. It's not the whole truth. And it's not the most important truth, because Dorothy Maynor moved beyond those limitations and became an internationally acclaimed concert soprano. Her artistry traveled where American institutions were too small to receive her. The crown jewel of the story is that Dorothy Maynor would eventually become the first Black board member of the Metropolitan Opera, and that matters. The institution that once represented exclusion eventually had to reckon with her excellence at the level of governance. As I mentioned before, in that sense, her life mirrors something seen in William Lloyd Imes, that first Black board member of Union Theological Seminary, his own alma mater. These are not simply stories of individuals succeeding despite exclusion. They are stories of Black leaders entering institutions, reshaping them, and building new ones for those who would come after them. When Maynor returned to New York, she did not return as someone diminished by exclusion. She returned as a world-class artist with a vision large enough to build an institution. Alongside her husband, the Reverend Shelby Rooks of St. James Presbyterian Church, she founded the Harlem School of the Arts. Her vision was beautifully simple. Talent was never scarce in Harlem. Access was the work. That sentence has become one of my principles and guiding principles as I've worked on this presentation. Talent was and is never scarce in Harlem. Access was the work. And I think that may be one of the greatest lessons institutions teach us. Institutions do not manufacture gifts, they create conditions under which gifts flourish. Many of you may know the name Langston Hughes. There's someone who told me once of a time when her parents told her to act really good because they were going on a tour of a library and they didn't want to get embarrassed. So make sure that you acted right. And then who came up the hill from Edgecombe on 141st Street, but Langston Hughes, to take a group of students from St. James Presbyterian Church and tour them through Harlem's library. And then he would even come back sometimes and teach Sunday school. So with Dorothy Maynard, what we're saying is that what followed over generations is remarkable. Consider Ray Chu. Today, many people know him as a musical director, arranger, and cultural leader who worked with Diana Ross, Luther Vandross, Roberta Flack, Donny Hathaway, Saturday Night Live, Showtime at the Apollo, American Idol, musical director for Dancing with the Stars and national political events. Yet that is not the story that I find most compelling. As a child, Ray Chu almost quit music because of stage fright. The community at Harlem School of the Arts encouraged him, supported him during the recital, and cheered him on. And as he went down the stairs into the basement, he said, because of that experience, he made the decision to continue in the arts. Sometimes an institution changes a life through a single moment of encouragement. And look, then there's Lenny Kravitz. Many people may immediately recognize his name because he may ultimately leave the broadcast global legacy in entertainment as one of these alumni. But his presence here in this presentation is not simply evidence of celebrity culture. It is evidence of institutional culture. His mother enrolled him at 8 at the Harlem School of the Arts, and Lenny Kravitz learned to play guitar at the Harlem School of the Arts when he was 8 years old. I find that detail extraordinary. Somewhere in Harlem, an 8-year-old child picked up a guitar and discovered a language that would eventually travel around the world. Harlem School of the Arts did not create Lenny Kravitz. It created conditions under which artistic possibility could flourish. And then Valerie Jo Bradley reminded me, there's Matthew Whitaker. Matthew is a pianist, organist, composer, musical savant who's been blind since infancy. His extraordinary gifts were recognized and nurtured by Harlem School of the Arts at an early age. And in his brilliance, has invited comparisons to Stevie Wonder. I want to be careful with that comparison because Matthew Whitaker is not significant because he resembles someone else. He is significant because his own gifts were noticed, named, and cultivated in a Harlem community that knew how to listen for possibility. His story reminds us again that talent was never scarce in Harlem. Access was the work. Someone saw a child whose gifts were already present and helped create room for those gifts to grow. Again, we see the same pattern emerging in Harlem. Someone noticed, someone encouraged, and someone made room. And that may be the most important legacy of all. I have become convinced that this is what institutions do at their very best. They notice gifts before the world notices them. They create environments in which people become who they might yet be. That is why I resist telling these stories as narratives of individual success, for they are stories of communal investment. These are stories of ecosystems. These are stories of adults who looked at children with nascent gifts and said, continue. There is something worth nurturing. One of our own members who studied and sang at Harlem School of the Arts, she actually became a biologist. But it was the being able to present herself fully in the vision of what she learned at Harlem School of the Arts that made her dare go into the sciences as an African-American woman in the 1950s. 4 generations you see on this slide that stand before us. Dorothy Maynor, Ray Chu, Lenny Kravitz, Matthew Whitaker. They're not just success stories. They are evidence that ecosystems work. And perhaps this is one of the greatest contributions St. James Presbyterian Church has made to Harlem itself. Through its leaders, partnerships, and institutions, it has consistently asked the same question over generations. What conditions can we create so that people can flourish? And this brings us to our final image. The image itself says almost everything we need to know. On one side, we see St. James in 1927. On the other side, we see St. James today. Nearly a century separates those photographs. And yet there is continuity that immediately reveals itself. The building remained. The witness expanded. I have come personally to understand that preservation is not simply about buildings. As we said before, buildings matter immensely, especially to everyone who's gathered here tonight. More importantly, preservation is also about relationships, memory, and commitments that refuse to disappear. That's why there is such a thing as Harlem, Save Harlem Now, and West Village preservation. Because it is about preserving patterns of community and community making that can be handed down from one generation to another. That's why I have become so interested in St. James, not merely as a congregation, but as an institution. For institutions have the capacity to carry memory forward. They become stewards of imagination. Today, St. James continues his witness through worship, preservation efforts, educational accompaniment, community partnerships, international relationships, technological ministry, and a commitment to liberation that stems from Shiloh, that remains rooted in the same questions earlier generations asked. I find myself returning often to William Lloyd Imes, Adam Clayton Powell Sr., Dorothy Maynor, and the countless unnamed people who built Harlem together. And like you all out there today, I wonder if they knew the full extent of what they were creating. Do you know the full extent of what you are creating? I suspect they did not, and I suspect that you do not. I suspect they simply understood that communities require places where people can gather, imagine, and invest in one another. And maybe that is one of the greatest lessons this journey offers us. Institutions are not monuments to the past. At their best, they are invitations to the future. As I've worked on this project, I've become increasingly convinced that Harlem was not discovered. Harlem was built. It was built by people who refused to surrender their imagination. It was built by institutions that carried memory northward. It was built by congregations that multiplied their witness. It was built by schools that recognized gifts before the world even noticed them. It was built by ordinary people who believed that another generation deserved opportunities they themselves may never fully enjoy. I want to end up this conclusion with a question rather than a conclusion, because I suspect that this is how all healthy institutions remain alive today. That has actually become one of the leading factors of St. James in our ministry and thinking and asking this question: how do we serve liberation quests today? Where does liberation need to happen? That is the question Samuel Cornish asked. It's the question Theodore Sedgwick Wright asks. Certainly the question Henry Highland Garnett asked. And yet it is also the question that William Lloyd Imes asked. It's the question that Shelby Rooks and Dorothy Maynor asked. That is the question that St. James continues to ask. Perhaps it is now our question as well. The address has changed. The witness remained. Harlem was built. The witness multiplied. The building remained. And the witness expanded and still expands. That's my 34 pages for y'all tonight. If you have any thoughts or questions, or there anything in the chat, please do make them known.
Do have one question in our Q&A.
Yes.
It reads, Sonny Rollins, saxophone colossus, who recently transitioned, was born in his grandmother's tenements on September 7th, 1930, on 137th Street, between 7th Avenue and Lenox Avenue. Can you please suggest a place in Harlem where either a plaque and/or a site can be landmarked by the Landmarks Preservation Commission?
Oh, there are historic markers that are first you're able to apply for, and it can be in the very spot where you just named that address. That very spot can actually be preserved first, and then we can move forward to and getting that designation. Like there's a little purple plaque in front of the Harlem School of the Arts for Dorothy Maynor. Getting that preservation plaque first and getting it noticed is really the first step to move towards preservation and historic designation, and then preservation and ideas of putting a plaque out there. And I'm sure that any home that recognizes, or any building that's there now, would recognize that as a wonderful honoring of the lineage for Sonny Rollins to have that plaque put there. But that first step would be to get one of those markers that says this is an historic place that we're noticing, and then the work can continue there to build upwards for that preservation process. And any kind of what would I do for the city to properly honor Sonny Rollins, who was born in 1930? Music, 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 music. Definitely to be able to get some of that music and to keep that alive, but to keep it alive in the streets of Harlem, to get some jazz up here, maybe to engage Lincoln Center to do a Sonny Rollins memorial concert every summer in St. Nicholas Park would be a wonderful charge, or maybe Jackie Robinson Park. I think that would be a wonderful way of remembering that, and not only to have it happen once, but to have it move forward like year after year, something that happens like that. Does any of the I believe that 456, does any of the addresses acknowledge that the churches at one time occupied the space? 456 Avenue, I believe, does. And believe it or not, the building in Tribeca, the clothing store, they actually have a picture of Cedric Wright on their counter. I went there one day just to sort of get a look at the space, and it's still preserved, and you can sort of imagine the back ways where people were hidden in that building, and they do have a picture that tells his story and that speaks of him. Most of the other addresses, as I mentioned, I would love to have an address have a plaque at the Canal Street, Lafayette Street subway station that notices that this was the birthplace of Black Presbyterianism in New York City was Shiloh Presbyterian Church. But the others, I don't think have many other of those monikers. And thank you all for your comments and about what you're learning and the inspiring path and helping us continue the building and growing of those who come after us and for those who come after us. And yes, the incredible emphasis on the creative effort it takes to keep an institution alive. I think, Beth, when you make that statement, for me, what's important about, I love history. I love history. And yet I understand that when things get written down in books, they're told mostly by the people who are the victors in being able to tell the story of the predominant story. And these narrative stories and these stories that we remember in community, they really flesh out what happens and what we read in history books and make it come alive. That's why I'm so much enjoy doing something like this and for presenting, even especially for people like Lorraine Maxwell, whose family has been a part of St. James for more than 40 years. So this has been really good. So thank you for that as well. And the history of a church shows how people flourish from the experience of being a part of community. And being a part of community is so important. And the institutions of faith that they were built on, it's so powerful. Even during the 1920s, after the Depression, it was the churches that actually, they weren't getting the WPA jobs that the government was giving out. They weren't getting the food distribution that the government was sending out. But it was the churches themselves who gathered as community and institutions to say, this is what we're going to do. Our churches came together, our institutions came together to say that we in Harlem will not starve because of the Depression. We're going to take care of one another. It's really powerful.
I mean, Reverend McQueen, that was an incredible presentation you made. Thank you so much for all of the research that you provided to give us some more information about what makes Harlem what it is. Neighborhoods are not isolated stories, you said. You also said, which encouraged me, was that adversity became opportunity. And I think that is still apropos for describing Harlem and what it means and what it's going through. And as we continue and as we morph into something different than what it originally was, it's always a field for change. And it's always nice to be reminded of that. And talking about reminding, I have to let you guys know that we are sponsoring this webinar with Village Preservation, our preservation partners in this event. Village Preservation is the city's largest neighborhood-based historic preservation nonprofit dedicated to documenting, celebrating, and preserving the special architectural and cultural history of Greenwich Village, the East Harlem, and the NoHo, that includes an incredibly rich Black history which extends back to the 17th century and includes a period in the 19th century when Greenwich Village was the center of Black life in New York. That's new, didn't know that. Until the community began its migration north. The Harlem Village Preservation has undertaken an enormous amount of research and programming to highlight its neighborhoods, Black history, which has often been erased or forgotten, including securing landmark designation for several endangered Black history sites and seeking designation for several more. And you can learn more about that work and explore those resources at the link dropped in the chat. So are we certain that the link has been dropped in the chat? Okay, Angelique dropped the link for you. Please go there. We are, I think, really blessed to have a partner like Village Preservation working with us and all of the great work that it has done to also preserve Black history as well as important city history that emanated within the village and Greenwich Village. I would also like to ask you guys to go to State Harlem Now's website to get additional information about other things we do, as well as other churches that are represented in our historic district. Our website is saveharlemnow.org. That's saveharlemnow.org. It's pretty easy. We will be continuing our On the Road to Harlem Black churches webinars in the future. So look out for announcements for our next program, because there are many other churches, as Reverend McQueen identified, who also started in Lower Manhattan, the Village, and moved up as congregations, as people moved up before they ended up in Harlem. And we need to hear that rich history, because I'm telling you, Reverend McQueen really shared some things that we didn't know. And, like, I just love it. And I'm going to have to go back and listen to the program again, watch the program again to get some of that rich history, because it was incredibly informative, incredibly great. It just speaks to the fabric of what makes Harlem Harlem, and that is the people who inhabited Harlem, the people who still live in Harlem. So with that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. This is the largest webinar group we've had to date for our program On the Road to Harlem. So thank you, everybody who joined us. And if you would like to, send us a donation too. And you can do that at our website. And we would love it if you could help us out that way, because that helps us continue to bring these kinds of rich programs to you. Thank you and good night.